All right, we are live. Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm Ranjani. This is episode 5 of Generative AI and I. Generative AI has been compared to this iPhone moment, one that has disrupted the way we communicate, bringing in historical technological change and advent of new apps and business models. Now, this isn't a space where there are a lot of experts. Everyone is on a learning journey, and the ones that stay ahead are the ones who are curious. So, in this new episode and this podcast, we talk to the builders, the doers, and the leaders with one goal to help you understand and be ahead in this new machine generated creative new world. With that, I'd love to introduce the topic and our guest today. Today, we are going to talk about how do you self learn generative AI to 10x your outcomes. And we have a fabulous guest with us today. Conor Grennan is the Dean of Students at NYU Stern School of Business. He's a New York Times #1 international best-selling author. He's the head of generative AI at Stern. He's a TEDx speaker. And I also watched your YouTube channel, Connor. I think you're totally crushing it with how you're working on educating folks on AI. So I'm so excited to have you here. And we're going to showcase and talk about how you leverage AI more effectively, why you think it's bound to change the way education works, and most importantly, how one can self learn generative AI. So, with that, welcome, Connor. Tell us a bit more about your background and your interest in this space.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love this topic and I love what you're doing. So thanks for having me. Yeah, so for me, this all started really, as all great things do, with my wife. My wife is works in AI for McKinsey and Company, the consulting firm,
Hmm.
and so AI is a big part of our family. And so when ChatGPT came out back in, I guess, late November, I dove right in, and I realized right away from diving very deeply into it that this was going to be absolutely revolutionary and transformational. And it occurred to me that beyond just using it for myself and our family and everything else, that in my role at the business school, NYU Stern School of Business,
Hmm.
uh, I realized because this was going to disrupt education so much, I would have an opportunity to actually train our MBA students on how to use ChatGPT. And my own feeling, and this is maybe a little grandiose, but I thought that, just with a bunch of MBA students using
Hmm.
this tool, that's how powerful it is. We could actually really revolutionize education together. So that's kind of how I got into that. And I'll just say one more sentence, which is I started, asking other heads of industry, well, how are you using it, so that I could teach our students better, and found out
Mm.
very quickly that they were not really using it, and they were asking me how I was using it. And that launched us into this sort of like new thing that I'm doing, which is now training corporate leadership teams on how to use it. So I've gone very, very deep into it.
Wow. Yeah, and you are like a role model in terms of how one can self-learn, right? So, Connor, if I understand right, you haven't worked in this space in itself, but looks like you started off and you decided that okay, this is a space which is interesting, so let me learn more. And over the period of what, last 6 months, 8 months, I saw your videos, which are quite in depth, right? So clearly, there's a lot of progress you've made, and sounds like that's what you're letting the other folks know as well. So
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah.
yeah, you really said that well, because I think that's a really critical point. I think one of the reasons why I started Generative AI at Stern, which is an initiative to teach our students and our faculty and our administration how to use this,
Mhm.
was that the presentations that I had been seeing were all very technical, and they were all about how large language models work, and they were about neural networks and in machine learning and things like that. And that is interesting, and it's critical for the space. However,
Mhm.
you mentioned iPhone early on. This is not something where you have to have any technical background whatsoever. In fact, I'm not even sure it's an advantage to have a technical background.
Mhm.
In the same way that when you're using your iPhone, you're not looking to understand what the underlying software is for it. You're just using it to order Ubers and Starbucks and get, buy flights and things like that. And
Mhm.
so the fact that I don't come from a technical background for me was a great advantage, because it meant
Yeah.
that I could really speak to this huge
Right.
population that does not have a technical background in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and say,
Yep.
This does not require that. And that, I think, coming at it from that standpoint actually turned out to be, for me at least, a real advantage.
Yeah, no, I quite love that. And I remember you mentioning that, you don't need to learn the LLMs. And that's important, right? Because most people start with, oh, okay, this is a new space. Let me learn the technology behind it. I don't think, to your point, that the majority of them need to or even have to do that, right? And you can still be as effective if you learn how to use it. So I think that's a completely different mindset shift. And thanks for sharing that. I think that's interesting. So, tell us a bit more about how do you envision the growth of in this space based on everything you've been reading up and doing, and what areas you see growing the fastest?
Yeah, I mean, AI is such a broad space, and so it could go in a lot of different directions. When I think about generative AI, I think there's a couple of things happening. I think that, first we have what we sort of think of as early adopters, right? So in the typical space, we know what that means. It's the people who moved very early over to iPhone from BlackBerry and things like that.
Yep. Hmm.
But in this case, I think we're looking at something a little bit differently, which I've been exploring a lot recently, which is, first of all, ChatGPT is the fastest downloaded program and tool in history, and it's not even close. But I think one of the interesting things about that fact is that
Hmm.
all the other things that were downloaded quickly, people knew what they were using them for. People knew what they were replacing. People knew sort of when you download, Spotify, which is on that list, you're replacing your CD collection, or Airbnb, you're replacing the endless hotel reservations, or Dropbox, you're replacing a filing system. But with ChatGPT, I'm not sure people really have a great understanding of what they're replacing. And that's kind of interesting to me, because I think that then, people default to the thought, well, maybe we're replacing Google or something like that because it's the closest thing. But I argue in my YouTube videos and everything else, it's actually almost the opposite of Google. It's not a tool with a command and response. It's really like speaking with a human. So I think with the early adopters, I think that places like Microsoft, Google, I think they're going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of integrating natural language processing, ChatGPT kind of tools, into tools that already exist. So, email and Excel and, entire workspaces. So I think to that extent, people are just going to be kind of dragged along. But I think the really interesting thing in terms of the evolution is who's going to be using this in the way that it can be used to really just completely transform productivity, because it goes really beyond just helping me write an email or something like that. This is a really deep learning tool and productive tool and production tool. And I think that is really the interesting thing about where this is heading, like who is going to adopt to that and who isn't.
Yeah. You raise interesting points, right? You're talking about how it could get integrated at points of consumption across everything which we use today. And to look at it differently, that it's not just replacing something which you're doing, but some way in which it would allow us to work more productively in itself, right? It reminds me of this concept of like coaching network I read about, Conor, where they talk about how this could act as a coach with you in everything which you do, right? Which is what you see it manifesting itself as with like the GitHub Copilot or the Copilot which you see within the browser. So it's quite interesting how this is panning out. That kind of brings me to a bit more around education and self-education at that, right? You are in the space, you're teaching MBA students, you're also doing this with corporate leaders. Now, what do you see as the disruption that this would bring in to our existing education models? And how do you think we should and can educate our future workforce who are today in colleges or schools?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because, when we think of education, we think of two different kinds of education, depending on, like, if you have kids, your thought immediately goes to, my kids are going to use this thing to cheat and they're never going to learn how to write. And, the panic, which, by the way, if, us as parents are feeling that, I'm a parent of a
Yeah.
14-year-old and a 12-year-old. Imagine what the teachers are thinking right now. Like, how are they going to figure this whole thing out? Right. So there's education in sort of the more traditional, thinking around education, like around kids up all the way up to college, and then there's the education in the corporate setting. And I think they're actually two very, very different things. And so on the education with our children and the next generation,
Mhm.
it's interesting because suddenly, almost overnight, we've lost the ability to test kids in certain ways, right? So it used to be, go home and write a paper on X, Y, and
Mhm.
Z and then come back. That is now gone. That's not a possibility anymore, because literally all they have to do is, anybody who's tried ChatGPT knows you can just say, write a paper on Shakespeare's Hamlet at the level of a seventh grader. And,
Mm,
3 minutes later, you have, a 500-word paper. And so right there, you're talking about huge disruption, because education has not really changed in
mm,
500 years, 1,000 years. I don't know. I mean, it's been, the teacher gives a question and the student comes back with the answer to that question. That has now changed dramatically, and not just dramatically, but almost overnight. It's not like we're saying, hey, this is going to be released in 12 months. Teachers
mm,
had to, really understandably just try to shut down access to ChatGPT in trying to figure out what to do. So in terms of the revolution that's coming, realistically, the revolution is already here. And so we have to really think about, okay, what are the new proxies for grading? Meaning, like, how do we actually test kids on their knowledge? And that's something that I think a lot of research is being done around. I think a lot of teachers are really thinking really deeply around that, as I am as well. And, I think it's going to be much more in the class. And actually, there's a great opportunity here along with that challenge, right? So the opportunity along with that comes along with that challenge is just around, well, were the kids really learning by going home and writing a 5-page paper on Hamlet? Maybe they
mm,
were. I mean, certainly they were learning how to write, which is really as I'm a writer by trade, so that's a really valuable skill that I put a lot of weight on.
uh-huh,
However, I'm not sure it was really learning. So maybe there's different ways of, having them go and do something and then come into the classroom and save the classroom setting for something where people are really being interactive and learning. I think that goes to the challenge and how to sort of address that. But I think
mm,
one of the other things that we haven't even allowed ourselves to get our heads around yet is just how powerful this is as a learning tool. And I did do a YouTube video around this just because, for example, my son came up with this idea. He was learning about German immigration into the United States in the 1880s. And instead of reading a textbook, Germans would get off the boat and they would find work. And, which is, yes, that's true, but
mm,
it's sort of a little dry. My son created this character and said,
mm,
"Hey, be a German immigrant coming off the boat. Tell me your name. Tell me what you're seeing, what you're smelling, everything." And it
mm,
created this incredibly interactive thing where he walked this German immigrant to his, where he would find housing and where he would find a job, and it was like living in a movie, and it was completely customized to what my son was looking for. So there's so many things like that in biology. For example, I made all the parts of the cell like Marvel superheroes and asked, well, what's the corresponding villains? And I created this big epic battle. So there's just tons of learning, opportunities here. So I think that's in traditional education. And then
mm,
in corporate education, it's almost the opposite problem, because I think, we grow up believing that getting too much help can be viewed as, cheating in some way.
yeah,
In the corporate setting, that's actually not the case. I mean, the corporate setting, people, you can go in and in the marketing department say, give me 20 ideas for how we can market this product.
mhm,
And it's not cheating. You know what I mean? Like, this is just gathering information. And so in the corporate setting, as long as people are gathering these tools and using ChatGPT to its maximum impact, which I think a lot of people are not doing, this is an incredible opportunity for them to really amp up their own productivity.
yeah. No, I love that answer, right? Especially kind of doubling down on the education part. You mentioned like two interesting things. Uh, how do we teach our kids? How do we test our kids? And how that should change from the model we are using today. And I love the example with your son as well. I was reading an interview, I think it was by Nadella, where he highlighted that his daughter was using ChatGPT to find answers for a essay that she was writing. And in the process of getting to the answer, she went down rabbit hole of researching and reading up and researching and reading up. That he felt like she learned more about it through the process versus writing the paper or just putting that down on a sheet, right? So I
Yeah.
think the way, and for us, I think the concern comes in the fact that they're not learning the same way that we probably learned. My daughter is 8, Connor, and she came home one day, said, photosynthesis, and she attributed, like, how do you explain photosynthesis with this framework called claim evidence reasoning? Like, let alone framework. Framework is nothing, is something I hadn't even heard when I was 8. But the sheer fact that she's thinking in terms of a framework and interpreting what it is versus how I learned, right? Like, this is the question, this is the answer. Let's learn the answer by heart and then go and put it out there during an exam. So I think the way we traditionally learned definitely has to change. And more importantly, the way we test our kids also has to change, right? And instead of just grading them against marks, is there a better way we could understand their conceptual knowledge of the topic? So I feel equally passionate about it, Connor. I'm so glad that people like you are thinking so deeply about it as well. So thanks for
Yeah,
sharing.
just another word on that too. I love what you're saying about your daughter because I'm finding the same thing myself. I'm finding using this as a learning tool and
Right.
actually really understanding things in a way that I've never done before. And I think ChatGPT, if it was just a learning tool, it would be the most powerful thing that we've ever seen. Because in the same way that humans tend to be bad learners, and the reason is because when you ask somebody a question, you don't go too deep into it because you don't want to appear dumb to the other person if you don't
Right.
understand. ChatGPT is not judgmental, and
Yeah.
so I think maybe one of the things your daughter is finding, because I'm finding as well, is this is something where I can just keep asking it and asking it and asking it, and then all of a sudden, learning at its core is actually really fun. It's just that the way we teach or the way we do learning in school sometimes is less fun.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like the point around just asking until you get your answers without. In real life, we tend to avoid that so that we don't appear as a dummy. So yeah, I think that's quite a valid point as well. So we spoke a lot about how it's changed, how you've self-educated, and also in terms of the need to do this. But one point which I usually get a lot from students, especially, is there's just such overwhelming amount of content in this space, Connor. Like every other day, I would see like 100 best AI tools. These are, look at this. This is a best article on this topic, or there's a release around this particular AI service. So there's a lot of content, right? So if anyone is starting off in this space, much like you did, how can I self-educate without getting overwhelmed with the quantum of information and content thrown at me?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I find myself in that space too. And I do this all the time, as I know you do too. And even for you and me, right? I think we were talking about this, like, when do you find time to sleep to try to
Yeah,
keep up with everything, right? So I know sometimes people will say, well, find people to follow and then read the news. But I kind of think, like, people have other lives. You know what I mean? Like, they're just trying to get on with their lives. So what is the easiest way to get started? So I will just say this. So anytime I see these like lists of 50 great tools, I just ignore it. They're very seductive because they think, you kind of think by taking this list of tools, somehow you're going to make your life perfect. But the truth is, using these AI tools actually does take some learning. And I'm
mm,
trying to, minimize the learning, because I think once people sort of see that it's, you actually have to learn these things, people stop. But there's
mm,
one place that's almost frictionless and almost, you can just dive right in. And that is with something like ChatGPT. It is free. You can have a subscription for, in the US, $20 a month, which is, very inexpensive, I think, for what it is. But even if you just do the free version, I would encourage people to go on to ChatGPT and just talk to it like a human. Just start sort of saying, hey, what's on your mind? Or, what, I was trying to figure out this or this or this. Or, hey, I'm trying to plant flowers in my garden and I live, for me, I live in Connecticut. I live just north of New York City. What flowers should I plant? And just test it out and just talk to it. And then you're already using AI. So that's number one. I think this sort of, like, if that's one, maybe 1A, and this is more for people in business who are sort of thinking, gosh, there's so many AI tools out there, where do I even get started? Here's one of the things that I like to do. Is I like to tell people, tell me like the top 3 things that you do during your day that just take up a lot of your day, because a lot of us are just cranking through emails and things like that, and it just takes a long time. And just take those 3 things, list them out, really be really specific about what they are, and then go into, Bing or ChatGPT connected to the internet. So that's basically Bing, or even onto Google tends to be a little bit behind, or go onto YouTube. YouTube's amazing like this. Just, search for, how do I write emails faster and more efficiently? How do I create this, research more efficiently? Or if you're in HR, how do I write job description? Just tell ChatGPT or tell, YouTube or something like that what you're doing. And you will quickly, very quickly sort of like start to find tools that match what you want to do. Because most people out there don't need 5 different tools for video editing, and like, they just don't need all these things. And I think the long list of AI tools tend to distract people from the things that they actually really need.
yeah. Um, yeah, I agree, right? There's always this FOMO, but I don't think the solution to that is to save more lists. So I'm very curious about how do you use this, Connor, like as a person in education? How do you see yourself leveraging AI across the tasks you have within your day, and how has it helped you?
It's funny. I really have to force myself to use it. So one of the things that I talk to people about is, we're so used to something like Google, where you have it's a command and response, and when you need some information, you go to Google and you say, "Hey, give me the top 10 things to see in Costa Rica," or something like that. And in fact, I have to remind myself that ChatGPT, first of all, is not Google. This is the difference between asking Google for the top 10 things and actually talking to the head of tourism for Costa Rica and having an hour-long conversation with that person about what you should do. So number one is, I have to remind myself to kind of keep asking follow-up questions and just, use it even almost before Google. And the other thing I really have to remind myself to do, but it's incredibly powerful for me, is, so for example, in my world, we're working with MBA students, and we're constantly coming up with programming and just the logistics around programming. So for example, we'd be in New York City and maybe we want to create a new type of orientation program for returning students to reintegrate them back into the program after their first year, and how do they focus on their own purpose and things like that. And usually this is something where our team gathers around and we talk through, first of all, what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? What would work best? We have this many people. What kind of venue? How long? All that kind of stuff. And even now, as deep into it as I am, I sometimes forget to just open my laptop and say, let's invite ChatGPT into this conversation. And so with almost any conversation at work, it can benefit from just inviting ChatGPT in as another thought partner in there. So that's how I use it a lot. Anytime I get stuck and my old brain is saying, oh my gosh, you have to come up with 10 new ideas for how to, whatever, and I'll be sort of slaving away with, pen and paper, so to speak. It occurs to me like, wait a minute, I have this incredible partner who can do this with me. And so I have to just kind of almost have a sticky note on my desk being like, did you ask ChatGPT about this yet? Because even if it doesn't give you the perfect answer, and by the way, it won't a lot of times right away, but it's an incredible, way to sort of like get your own brainstorming going and to bounce ideas off and everything like that. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah, and I did, thanks for flagging that, right? That's something I wanted to call out. It's not like a utopia for all of your questions, and it doesn't provide you tailor-made answers, but it is a good starting point. I'm curious about one follow-up though. So you talk about educating corporate leaders, you talk about working with students. How do you see them different, right? In terms of how do you see the learning path being different for each of those, or the way they learn is different?
Very much so. It's an interesting thing to highlight, right? Because I don't often think about it, but it really is. So, with corporate leaders and with, adults basically who have sort of already have experience, there's a tendency to just validate how you've always worked in the past and to sort of take a new system and layer it onto the old kind of junky system of your thinking and just sort of say like, well, now it can allow me to do my junky way of thinking better, which is not
Mm,
terribly helpful. Kids, though, it's really cool. I have found with kids or young people in general, if you just kind of start showing them what this thing can do,
mhm.
kind of like maybe like your daughter, like they find rabbit holes very,
Yeah.
very quickly. And so, with my son, I was saying like, hey, listen, just see what you can do with this. And
Mm,
they are not in the same way that young kids are very good at learning languages because they're not embarrassed about practicing. I think it's really about that. I'm not even sure it has so much to do with how the brain functions. They're
mm,
not embarrassed. They just practice. And I think
yeah.
with kids, they think, wow, this is like really fun. And this is something I sometimes hesitate to say because it sounds a little trite, but I encourage people to try to have fun with ChatGPT before they give it a work problem. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I encourage people to say, hey, write a choose your own adventure type story for your bedtime story for your child, or come up with 5 ways of teaching biology that
Mm,
could be really fun, or ask ChatGPT 5 ways of teaching biology that involve again, like I did, like Marvel movies or something like that.
mm,
And the reason I often start with that kind of thing is that it just sort of like unlocks what this thing can do. And so as soon as you start seeing that, I mean, that's how I did it, right? I started kind of messing around and having it write poems and things like that. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And
mm,
I was like, well, if it knows that, I wonder what else it knows. And so I said, tell me about string theory, as if I was, 10 years old. And it did that. And then I was like, well, that was kind of cool. I'm like, okay, now, put it in the analogy of, making, balloon animals or something, and it did that. I was like, wow, that was kind of cool. And so by the time I got to hey, help me write this email. I had no doubt that not only would it do that, but I could correct it. So I'll say, hey, write this email to my boss asking for this and this and this. And then I'll say, oh, actually, my boss, is a giant Real Madrid fan. So, put in some analogies about that, or, just things like that. And before you can think, it does that. So I think the big difference between how kids learn and how corporate leaders learn is corporate leaders are sort of like already in their box. And so when I train corporate leaders, I try to just yank them out of that box. You know what I mean? And just sort of like try to get them thinking differently.
Right. There's a lot of unlearning to do over there versus kids, right, where it's way more organic. But on that topic, with respect to kids specifically, right, I'm talking about like school or even college going kids. One thing I wonder about is how parents can look at this, Connor. Like as a parent who works in the space, I feel strongly that this will change the future of education, and that's something I handhold my kid. Right, I can tell her this is how you use it, and this is how you use it responsibly. I can highlight to her that these are the gaps which exist, right? Because everything is not rosy. There are gaps which comes with it. There is hallucination which happens, and how do you use it more effectively? Those are things I can highlight. But I'm curious about how do you go about it, right? As a parent, generally, what would your recommendations to parents be in terms of how they can help their kids?
Yeah, I mean, parents. So this is an incredible parenting tool.
Mm.
So I did this video the other day that was, I was sort of trying to demonstrate the amazingness of Bing, for example, and the way that I was doing it was sort of saying, "Hey, my daughter was dyeing her hair red, 12-year-old
Mm-hmm.
daughter. That's cool. I'm fine with that.
Uh-huh.
But she and her friend were using hair dye
Mm.
kind of in the house, and hair dye doesn't really come out. And so in order to demo this, I'm kind of speaking like this because my daughter might be in the next room there. you know it's hair dye gets on the wall or something, so I go and I'm demonstrating on a YouTube video, hey, listen, this is how you can use Bing. Hey, Bing, tell me how to get hair dye out of a wall, and it will tell you all that and show you a video. And then I kind of got to thinking, like, Bing, also, I'm a little frustrated because I asked my daughter to be careful, but she was just doing what she was doing, and I want to be a good dad. What should I say? And Bing was so empathetic, and Bing was like, listen, I love that you're trying to be a good dad. And your daughter really was just experimenting, and it's great that she was being independent. She also probably has to understand that with independence comes certain responsibility. And I was like, this is the best parenting advice I've ever gotten. So I think sort of like just really explicitly in terms of how to get parenting advice, you can do that, but also just hey, I have to throw a 10-year-old a birthday party. What are 5 interesting ideas? Or hey, my 13-year-old loves Manchester United or loves Formula One. Like, what's a cool kind of like birthday weekend that we can do without actually taking them to it? Like it can just like brainstorm with you and just takes a lot of the pressure off parenting. Parenting has enough stress. There's so many ways that we can use this to help us out.
Yeah. One thing which I really liked about your examples is, first of all, you seem to have like embraced this 100% right. I'm sure you use it way more than I do as well. But the other part which you highlighted is how our interaction with this is different from everything else we use. Like even in a search engine, right? We ask a question. And I think we tend to extend that behavior to ChatGPT as well. We are asking questions. We're not having a conversation. But when we start having a conversation, it's very hard, right? Exactly what you said to say, but you know what? This is what my daughter is doing, and this is why it's hard for me. Like we don't tend to have such conversations with the interface. But what you're calling out is even when you do that, you get empathetic responses, and that's learned behavior. And that's probably why it is taking time for folks to make that switch, right? Because it's not the way we are used to interacting with interfaces. So I really like that example there.
Yeah, it's you're dead on, and it's something that I teach almost above all else, which is, you know, you have to talk to this thing like a human in order to get the best response out of it. However, just saying that is not particularly helpful because, as you know, right, because you just articulated, our brain sees ChatGPT, and our brain has learned. So our brain is great at 3 things, right? More than 3 things, but it's great at pattern and prediction and automation. And so that's for survival mechanisms. And that's why, you can drive to work and not even remember getting there because your brain has just automated certain things. I'll get ready for work or something, and I'll be like, how did I get ready for work? Because your brain has automated it so that your prefrontal cortex can think about a lot of different other things, like, is this
Mm.
other car about to slam into me or something like that, right? so understanding that helps us in this regard, in this sort of sense. When our brain sees Google, it knows what to do. In the same way, when our brain sees a baby, you don't have to think, remember to talk to this like a baby and not like a
Yeah.
college professor. You just do, because your brain has automated that, right? And so here's where it sort of starts to betray us. And I mean our brain in this case. When we see something like ChatGPT actually looks like Google. Now, ChatGPT looked like you or like me, like really real, not like a robot, like really, really real. Maybe it would be easier to talk to it like a human, but it doesn't. It looks like something else. And so our brain says, this is what this is. So you can say, talk to it like a human,
Mm.
but our brain is sort of trying to steer us back to that wide neural path that says, this is how you do it. This is how you do
Yeah.
it. This is how you do it, because it's automated it already. So that's why I have sort of different principles that I teach around. Sort of like, one is just this HTG principle, which is hi, thanks, great. And I say, it's going to sound a little strange or feel a little strange, but say hi to it and say thanks and things like that, because it keeps you in the model and the mode of being conversational with it. I remember, my physical therapist was like, hey, you have to, all your problems are being caused by your posture, and you have to stand like this. So I start standing like this. I'm like, this feels really weird. He's like, yeah, but that's normal. It feels weird to you because you haven't done it in this, for your whole life. That's the same thing. We haven't talked to it like a human before. Haven't talked to something like Google like a
Yeah.
human before. It's going to
Yeah.
take some getting used to, and it's going to feel strange, but the productivity you'll get out of it will far outweigh anything you could have gotten otherwise.
It is definitely like acquired behavior. Like even for the voice assistant, it's so hard for me to talk to it as you would talk to a human. But my daughter makes it a point to remind me, Amma, please be polite to Google, right? Like, why are you asking it to do things? Why don't you use magic words like please and thank you, right? So, yeah, I think kids tend to learn faster that way. So, kind of going to the flip side, we spoke about all the great advantages and how do you pick up skills. But what do you think is the flip side around this, right? In terms of both challenges you face as well as ethical concerns surrounding the space. And what are your thoughts over there? And how do you think they can be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, responsible AI is real, right? I mean, so we start with just all the, and I just was talking about this on places like LinkedIn, other things like that. But like, you know, we have to remember that the deep fake problem is very real. So I mean, fake photos, fake videos, fake voices, everything else. So that's number one. But also just how we use and employ this. And so in education, we have to make sure that it's not. I'll say this. I think we have this incredible opportunity to actually close the digital divide, not widen it. But it really depends on, you know, making sure that this democratized AI is actually democratized and bringing this out. And so we don't sort of like have this great spanning where the sort of like the haves are getting, or the rich are getting richer, so to speak. And I think in the corporate setting as well, sort of, there's a challenge around, there's people that are using it despite sort of like this idea that, you're not really supposed to be putting your data in, and you're not really supposed to be using this as, copyright violations and all that kind of stuff. So I think that the responsible part of responsible AI is huge. I think the biggest challenges are really around things like deepfakes and things like that. We have to validate and verify. And maybe that's why, in a sense, the hallucinations early on are actually not the worst thing in the world, because it's really showing people you have to validate these, things that you're seeing. And maybe it's actually going to teach us to not trust everything that we see and to validate in that. To me, that's where responsible AI starts. There's also a lot of huge challenges around bias and things like that. The reason why I don't necessarily over-index on them at this stage is that the whole internet is biased. Everything's biased in one way or another, and we tend to look for the bias that matches our bias. The reason why this can be more dangerous is if this really starts to sound human and starts to sound unbiased, and this becomes like the unbiased sort of, just a software, but it's built with biases in there, like who's programming it and everything else. That's where I think we run into trouble, and that's where I think even OpenAI and some of the large companies are going before, Congress in the United States, for example, and saying, yeah, we need regulation. We need to see what's going into these models, what's going into those black boxes. Because I think without that, and when we don't understand sort of like how these things are being created, we can't make our own judgment about the bias. And that's where I think right now is kind of leading us toward, something of a minefield.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a very nuanced, complicated issue in itself. No straight questions or answers there. I remember maybe a podcast with Sam Altman where he calls out, okay, we want to align AI. Align with what? Like whose opinion is the right opinion? Like when you say it is unbiased as per who, right? So I think that in itself is a fundamental question, right? Um, but having said that, yes, I think responsibility lies at both ends, the consumer as well as the creator. Are we ensuring that we are building tools appropriately? Like, for example, if we have, someone was telling me this founder of a startup that they used synthetic data to train their models, and the outcome couldn't necessarily differentiate the real voice samples, right? So that is going to happen. There's going to be more and more AI or synthetic generated data. How do you differentiate that from the original? If you make a copy of a copy of a copy, what happens to the original? Like there are all of these fundamental questions. And then it comes to the consumers themselves. Like, are we being cognizant of how we're using it and not using it as like a utopian solution for everything? You called out the need to protect data, be very aware of what we enter, where we enter. So and in the same way responsibly teaching our kids and students as well, right? So
Yeah.
definitely something which is evolving, but thanks for kind of sharing your views there. I'm going to have one other question for you before we conclude, right? um, you teach a lot of kids, you teach a lot of students, so what advice would you give to someone who is interested in pursuing a career itself in generative AI?
Yeah, I guess I would say number one, hold on to everything kind of lightly. Like, this is moving so fast that, I don't even know what's going to happen with coding and programming and things like that. We're even moving toward, I think, a
Mm-hmm.
world where it's not that coders are going to be critical because they're going to be coding the underlying models of all this. So, I really encourage people to go out and learn how to code. However, at the lower level of coding, I think it's going to just turn into natural language. So I'm not even sure that that's going to be as relevant a skill unless you really go kind of like really all in on coding. Now, I do think coding is absolutely critical, but I wouldn't sort of like hold on to things. Now, machine learning is really critical. All these things about how these models work is really critical. However, it's very hard to see what's going to happen in a year, 2 years, 3 years. What I would do if you are interested in this, that's the kind of, place where I would say, find the people that you trust and you follow. Try these tools, just test things out, because the interesting thing now is that this is the moment where you can be an early adopter and really get ahead, and you can get ahead almost exponentially, because it's going to be very hard for other people to catch
Yeah.
up with you. And so I would just advise people to go on, start using ChatGPT, start using AI tools, just start understanding and familiarizing yourself with what's out there and what some of the big companies, the Apples, Metas, OpenAI's, Google's, places like that are doing. Because if you can sort of stay on top of that, then you will be the one teaching either other students in your class, other college students, other people in your firm, what these things are. And then you start to get a reputation for the person that understands AI. We are so early in this world that you
Mm.
actually have an opportunity to really stand out as somebody who understands this stuff. And we are in this golden age where all this is natural language. And it's, so you don't need to be a machine learning expert to understand how to use these things. So what I would say is, right now, the name of the game is just practice on these tools. Just get familiar with, start reading, subscribe to a few. I have subscribed to probably 7 or 8 newsletters that I read every single day, just because there's so much great information out there. And then you start to see which ones are the ones that are really practical. But and there's tons of podcasts out there. Just keep up with that news, because it's happening very, very fast. And this is just for people who are really into this and really want to sort of like make a name for themselves and everything else. Everybody else, I would say, just get a baseline of understanding this, because work is going to just revolve around this, and companies are really going to be looking for people who have these skills in generative AI.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are folks who always look for like, tell me exactly which course should I take and what things should I learn or which book should I read to get there. I don't think there's something like that, right? Like a silver bullet which will get you to all of it. So I really like your answer around, if you're interested in a particular space, go and figure it out, right? Do more research on it, play with it, get hands-on on it. And I think that's the best way to learn, given how quickly things are evolving. So
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that. So, you spoke about a bunch of newsletters and podcasts. So, in conclusion, any concluding thoughts, Connor? And then would also love to hear your recommendations of podcasts and newsletters which you regularly read, which allows you to stay up to date in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think we've covered a lot. I really appreciate your questions. I think they've been great. Yeah, I mean, the things, the way that I just got started was I just sort of, I think Twitter is a phenomenal source. LinkedIn is a phenomenal source. Like, sort of, I'm all over LinkedIn, but a lot of other great folks are all over LinkedIn. And then the cool thing is that, just find one or two people. So like there's, the neuron, and there's, like sort of just, I'm trying to remember even the names of them. I just sort of, the AI breakdown and places like
Mm.
that just have Twitter feeds that just, they're just putting out stuff really every day. And then what I do is I read what they're doing. And then, Twitter and other places will recommend other, huge machine learners and things like that, people who are really doing great spots, great things in these cases. And so I just start following all of those people. And then you start to weed out the people who are just reposting AI tools over and over again. And you start to weed that out. But then you'll start to find, on Substack, Ethan Mollick, is a fantastic place to start. He's a professor at Wharton, which is the big business school at Penn. He puts out incredible stuff on Twitter. Even if you just start with some people like that and see who's following him or who he's following, that's huge. And on podcasts, I literally just started by going in and saying, ChatGPT. And I found a few just really outstanding ones. There's a Marketing for AI, I think, podcast, which looks like it's just for marketing, but these guys are just phenomenal in what they're putting out. Cognitive Revolution is where I get a ton of my great information. I think there's one called the ChatGPT podcast by a guy named Jaden Schaefer. I listen to him almost every day. It's just like 10-minute snippets. There's the AI breakdown. There's just great stuff, and people are putting stuff out there all the time. And you can choose whether you want the more in-depth stuff, like the Cognitive Revolution stuff, or if you want just the snippets, like the ChatGPT podcast with Jaden Schaefer or something like that. And
Mm.
those are just some great places just to get started.
Got it. Yeah, definitely a lot of great content out there. And I would, like you said, right, be closer to the creators in itself versus the ones who are potentially like reposting stuff and go down that rabbit hole, right? So I love this conversation, Connor, because it talks about the journey of someone who's developed interest in the space, learned themselves, and kind of got to a stage where you actually teach others, right? So it's a lovely story, and I wish you well in terms of your going ahead and doing this with other folks as well. And I loved your responses throughout, right? So thanks for your time and great having you here.
Thanks, Roger. I really enjoyed it. Those were great questions. I learned a lot today as well. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Until we meet you again in the next episode of Generative AI and I.